So, the title of my talk is Beyond the Clinic, Fostering Intercultural Competence Through the Psychosocial Determinants of Health in the EMP Classroom. What I will present today is a small scale teaching intervention carried out at the University of Salamanca within the Erasmus Plus Migramedia project. But more importantly, I think it is an argument about where and how intercultural competence can be meaningfully developed in medical education. So intercultural competence is often invoked in medical education, but it is not always clearly defined. One widely cited formulation describes it as the appropriate and effective management of interaction between people who, to some degree or another, represent different or divergent affective, cognitive, and behavioral orientations to the world. And I think two elements of this definition are particularly relevant in clinical contexts. First, that difference operates not only at the level of language, but at the level of values, perception, and lived experience. And second, that competence is not simply knowledge, but the capacity to act appropriately within that difference. And this moves us away, I think, from a more reductive understanding of intercultural competence as a checklist of skills and toward a more relational and interpretive model. Building on this definition, Michael Varam's work reframes intercultural competence as a form of mediation. The most competent intercultural mediators, he argues, are those who understand the relationship between their own language and culture and those of others, and who can operate between them as reflective agents. So, of course, this is relevant in a language classroom, but in medical terms, this is critical because clinical encounters are not neutral exchanges of information. They are mediated by language, by institutional structures, and by asymmetries of power. And to be interculturally competent, therefore, is not simply to understand the patient and what they are saying, but to recognize one's own position within that interaction as to be able to navigate it responsibly. And this has, of course, direct implications for how we teach future doctors. I think it suggests that intercultural competence cannot be reduced to communication training alone. It also requires critical awareness, reflexivity, and an understanding of the broader contexts in which health and illness are produced. So the field of medical humanities or health humanities has long advanced precisely this view of medicine. Scholars such as Rita Charon and Arthur Kleinman have argued that illness must be understood not only as a biological event, but as a cultural narrative and social experience. So from this perspective, clinical practice is inseparable from context, from the lived realities of patients, from systems of inequality, and from the meanings that we attach to illness. Paul Farmer developed a concept of the concept of structural violence, which further reinforces this point by demonstrating how social conditions such as poverty, displacement, and racism become embodied as patterns of disease and suffering. And taken together, all these approaches position medicine as a deeply social practice, then one that requires interpret skills as well as technical competence. In Spain, however, the integration of these perspectives into medical education has been very limited. Curricula remain predominantly biomedical and structured around organ systems, pathologies, and procedural knowledge, with relatively little space given to critical, reflective, and socially informed approaches. And this creates a structural gap in an increasingly globalized and multicultural context that is marked by immigration and transnational health challenges. A training that focuses exclusively on physiological processes risks producing doctors who are technically proficient but insufficiently prepared for the realities of clinical practice. The question then is not whether intercultural competence matters, but where in the curriculum it can be meaningfully developed. And my argument is that the English for Medical Purposes classroom offers a particularly productive site for this development. EMP already operates at the intersection of language, culture, and professional practice. It is one of the few spaces where students systematically engage with international materials and where translation, both linguistic and cultural, is central. And we also have a flexibility in the teaching format. And this flexibility, I think, allows for the integration of materials that are not typically present in clinical training. Crucially, EMP also functions at a discursive level. It asks students to interpret, to compare, and to articulate ideas. And in this sense, it creates the conditions necessary for the kind of reflexive engagement that intercultural competence requires. So the intervention I designed to test this emerges from this intersection between medical humanities and English for medical purposes, focusing on the development of intercultural competence. So it takes migration and refugee health as its central focus, not as an isolated topic, but as a particularly effective entry point into the psychosocial determinants of health. This is because displaced populations make visible the structural dimensions of health, the ways in which access to care is shaped by legal status, by economic precarity, by trauma, and by political conditions. And at the same time, migration is heavily mediated through public discourse. So it makes it an ideal context for analyzing how language and representation shape our perception of reality. In other words, this topic allows students to move from more abstract categories that they study in more theoretical subjects, such as social determinants of health, to more concrete and lived realities, while simultaneously developing the interpretive skills that are required for intercultural competence. The intervention was implemented with third-year medical students enrolled in the compulsory module Inglés Científico at the University of Salamanca. The lesson consisted of 2 sessions and was designed within the framework of the Erasmus Plus Migramedia project, which explores migration narratives in European media and promotes critical engagement with their representation. The assessment of this intervention took the form of 2 short written reflections by the students. One at the beginning, one at the first session, which established a baseline, and one at the end of the second session, which sought to capture shifts in the students' understanding. So the first session introduced students to transnational medical contexts and to the role of international organizations such as Médecins Sans Frontières, the Red Cross, and the World Health Organization. This was followed by selected excerpts from James Urbensky's Nobel Peace Prize speech, which frames medical action in crisis not as charity, but as a defense of human dignity. Through these 2 selections, students engaged with key vocabulary and applied it in small group discussions and exercises that addressed questions such as responsibility for migration and access to healthcare. And the session concluded with the first written reflection, which was designed to surface existing assumptions about migrants and healthcare. Then the second session shifted focus to media representation and lived experience. Students analyzed newspaper headlines in English given by the teacher to examine how language frames migration, and then engage with selected clips from the documentary Human Flow, which depict daily life in refugee camps and the medical challenges that are associated with displacement. This allowed for the introduction of more specialized vocabulary while grounding these terms in concrete contexts. The session concluded with a discussion of the social determinants of health that applied to these situations that we saw in class, and Article 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which describes the right to health, followed by some exercises to solidify the vocabulary and the second written reflection. So the initial reflections written by the students revealed a set of assumptions that were largely shaped by social and media discourse. Students frequently refer to beliefs that migrants overuse healthcare systems, or that they receive unequal or discriminatory treatment by the institutions, while many recognize that these ideas are rooted in racism, xenophobia, or media influence. Their understanding of migrant health remain relatively generalized and focus on practical barriers such as language or lack of documentation. However, the final reflections showed a clear shift. For instance, students' definitions of health were expanded beyond the biomedical model, which they had shown at the beginning, to include social, economic, and psychological dimensions, and often invoking dignity and quality of life. They thus demonstrated an increased awareness of how inequality, politics, and structural conditions shape health outcomes. More importantly, most students articulated a sense of professional responsibility that extended beyond the hospital setting, framing medicine as inherently connected to questions of justice and human rights. And what is significant here is not any single response, but the trajectory that it drew. From reproducing assumptions seen in media to interrogating them, and from more isolated observations to a more structurally informed understanding. So this intervention on its own obviously does not produce interculturally competent physicians. Evidently, its scope is limited to a single cohort, a short-term intervention, and mostly self-reported data. However, it demonstrates, I think, that the conditions necessary for fostering intercultural competence do exist within the EMP classroom. When informed by the medical humanities and by critical engagement with media and global health issues, I think English for medical purposes can function not merely as a site of linguistic training, but as a space for ethical, cultural, and professional formation that is very, very relevant for our multicultural and globalized society, particularly in contexts where medical curricula have not yet fully integrated these dimensions, as it's still largely the case in Spain. This is very much not a marginal opportunity, but a structurally significant one. Thank you very much for your attention. I will be glad to answer any questions that might arise.